Have you ever been part of a massive top-down system update?
Oh, man. You mean like when a new management team just swoops in?
Exactly. Picture it. They come in, they look at how things have been running for years, and they just decide everything needs to be standardized.
Right. They roll out this sweeping new protocol.
Yeah, maybe it's, a global software platform or some rigid new corporate policy. And on paper, like in the boardroom presentation, the flow charts look absolutely
Oh,
flawless.
they always look perfect on the projector.
Right. But the second that update actually goes live, it causes absolute unmitigated chaos for the people on the ground.
Yeah, because the architects of those systems, they almost always assume that human behavior will just, seamlessly mold itself to the new rules.
Which it never does.
Never. They failed to understand the organic, often completely unwritten ways a system was already functioning before they arrived to, quote-unquote, fix it.
Well, today, for this deep dive, we are examining one of the most spectacular high-stakes system updates in human history.
It really is a massive one.
It is. We are diving into a huge stack of historical research anchored by the fifth report from the Select Committee on the Affairs of the East India Company.
So we're looking at documents from the late 18th and early 19th century.
Exactly. And the mission for you, the listener, is to explore what happens when an expanding empire tries to take its rigid bureaucratic ideals and just blindly install them over an ancient, deeply complex society.
Yeah, and to really grasp the scale of the administrative whiplash we are talking about, we have to look at the landscape of regions like Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa before the British overhauled everything.
Right, set the scene for us.
So the social and economic fabric of those provinces relied on native Indian landholders. They were known as zemindars.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when I hear the word landholder, my modern brain instantly pictures like a standard landlord collecting rent checks on the first of the month.
Which is a totally natural assumption. But how did the zemindar role actually function in practice?
Yeah, how did it work?
They operated on a completely different level. I mean, a zemindar was essentially the sovereign manager of a massive territory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Their primary function was collecting the land revenue to pass up the chain, sure, but their authority bled into every aspect of local life.
So they weren't just collecting checks.
Not at all. They were personally bound to keep the peace. They funded and directed the local watchmen. If a murder or a robbery happened, it was on the zemindar to apprehend the culprit.
Wait, really? So they were basically the local government?
Basically, yeah. And beyond just the government, they acted as this strange form of insurance.
Insurance, how so?
Well, if a tenant had property stolen by bandits, the zemindar was historically held personally answerable to the injured party to make up for the loss.
You're kidding?
Nope. It was this intricate web of consolidated power, but also intense personal liability.
Okay, so the British arrive with their Enlightenment-era ideals. They look at this setup, and they probably see just a massive conflict of interest.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, to a European administrator, the idea that the local tax collector is also the police chief, the judge, and the insurance provider, that must have seemed like a recipe for absolute tyranny.
That's exactly how they thought. They labeled the entire structure fundamentally abusive. The British philosophy was built heavily on the separation of powers. You can't have one person holding all the cards.
Right.
So they decided to dismantle that consolidated authority, mostly to protect the peasant cultivators from exploitation.
Which brings us to the first major phase of this system update. The British roll out something called the permanent settlement.
Right, the permanent settlement.
The whole idea was to stabilize the economy and protect the tenants from being squeezed for, random arbitrary taxes.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer inflexibility of the mechanism they chose. The administration decided to calculate the revenue a zemindar owed the government and lock that number in perpetuity.
Like forever.
Forever. A flat rate. And at the exact same time, they passed laws banning those zemindars from arbitrary exactions.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning the landholder could not legally invent new taxes or suddenly hike the rent on their tenant farmers just to cover a shortfall.
Okay, on the surface, if I'm a tenant farmer, that sounds incredibly fair.
It really does.
Yeah, I know exactly what I owe, and my landlord can't suddenly demand more of my crop. But the British attached an incredibly aggressive penalty for the zemindars, didn't they?
They did. They implemented what became known as the Sunset Law.
The Sunset Law. That just sounds ominous.
It was. So the revenue payments were due on specific days. If the sun went down on that day and your payment wasn't in the government treasury.
Literally at sunset.
Literally at sunset. If you missed it, the British immediately seized your ancestral lands and put them up for public auction to the highest bidder to cover the debt.
Wow. I want to make sure I understand the bind these zemindars were suddenly in. It's like taking out a massive, unforgiving mortgage on an apartment building.
Okay, yeah.
But then the city passes a new law saying you are legally forbidden from quickly evicting tenants who refuse to pay rent.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because the bank doesn't care if your tenant's paid or not. They are still going to foreclose on you at the end of the month while your tenants just sit in the building and watch it happen.
Exactly. The analogy fits perfectly because it highlights the mechanical flaw in the policy. The British stripped the zemindars of their traditional, sometimes coercive, methods of forcing tenants to pay.
Right.
And the rural cultivators and intermediate tenants were incredibly shrewd. Word traveled fast through those agrarian networks.
Oh, I bet.
They collectively realized that the once powerful zemindars were suddenly, completely toothless.
So if a tenant simply decides, I'm just going to withhold rent, what is the zemindar supposed to do?
Well, under the new British system, their only recourse was to file a formal lawsuit in the newly established British civil courts.
Oh, man. Knowing how slowly legal systems move today, I can't imagine that was a quick process. The tenants must have known that.
They absolutely counted on it. Entire communities would engage in rent strikes with total impunity.
That's wild.
And the financial collapse of the zemindars was just swift and brutal. The source documents contain these really stark lists of the casualties.
Like who?
Some of the oldest, most formidable aristocratic families in the country, the Rajas of Nudia, Rajashai, Bishampur, they were systematically dismembered. The report specifically notes these ancient families were driven to distress and beggary.
Because their estates were being sliced up and auctioned off every single month, all to pay a rigid government tax bill they had no way to fund.
Exactly.
The administration basically engineered the financial ruin of the local aristocracy by trying to protect the system from them.
And the fallout was so severe that by 1799, the government was forced into a humiliating backtrack.
What did they do?
They passed Regulation the 7th, which restored the zemindars' power to distrain or physically seize the crops and property of defaulting tenants.
Oh, wow. They just gave the power back.
They had to. They realized their utopian revenue model had effectively paralyzed the entire rural economy.
So that transition from the revenue failure directly begs a massive question about the legal system itself.
Oh, definitely.
Because if the zemindars' only original option was to sue their tenants, what was actually happening inside those civil courts?
Well, to understand the civil justice jam, we have to look at the sheer demographic scale here.
Okay, how big are we talking?
Based on calculations by figures like Sir William Jones, we are talking about provinces with an estimated population of between 27 and 30 million people.
30 million. That is an overwhelming number of people to govern with an imported legal framework.
Right, and Lord Cornwallis, the British Governor General, had a very specific, idealized vision for how justice should operate for those 30 million people.
Let me guess. He wanted it to be perfectly fair.
He wanted the courts to be highly accessible. So the administration actually abolished all deposit fees for filing a civil suit.
Wait, they made lawsuits free?
Completely free.
For 30 million people?
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you see the Enlightenment optimism at play.
I mean, I guess so.
The administration assumed that if you remove financial barriers, the system will simply, process legitimate grievances fairly.
But sociologically?
Exactly. Sociologically, when you introduce a completely free, highly bureaucratic legal avenue into a densely populated, deeply complex society, the local population will inevitably weaponize it.
It sounds like a recipe for an absolute explosion of litigation.
Oh, is a tsunami.
No!
The resulting wave of lawsuits instantly drowned the infrastructure. People filed suits for petty squabbles, strategic delays, and just to harass their rivals.
It's just clogging up the system.
Completely. The report gives us a staggering snapshot. In the district of Burdwan alone, there were 30,000 civil suits pending before a single judge.
Wait, 30,000 cases for one person?
One person.
That defies comprehension. How do you even organize that paperwork?
You don't. Administrators mathematically calculated that even if the judge worked at maximum efficiency without ever sleeping or resting, clearing just the existing backlog would exceed the ordinary duration of human life.
Okay, but I want to play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure, go ahead.
Even if it's messy, isn't making justice free and accessible to the average person fundamentally a good thing? I mean, at least people have a venue to air their grievances instead of resorting to violence.
It is a noble philosophy, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the mechanical reality of a broken system creates the exact opposite effect. Delayed justice is, in practice, denied justice.
Ah, I see what you mean.
When the line for a courtroom is a lifetime long, the law ceases to act as a deterrent. Bad actors realize they can withhold rent, steal property, or breach contracts because they know they will never actually face a judge.
Right, because the case won't be heard for 40 years.
Exactly. The free courts didn't provide justice. They provided a shield for opportunists.
So how did the British stop the entire administrative state from grinding to a complete halt? I mean, they couldn't just import thousands of judges from London.
No, they couldn't. So they had to rapidly abandon their idealistic stance and reinstate filing fees.
Hmm.
They purposely made justice expensive again just to repress the sheer volume of cases.
A quick fix, but probably necessary.
Furthermore, they were forced to heavily outsource the labor. They appointed native commissioners to handle the petty claims, basically anything under 50 rupees.
Did that help?
Massively. While European judges managed to clear a few thousand cases, these native commissioners processed over 328,000 suits in a single period.
Wow.
Yeah, they were the only pressure valve keeping the civil justice system from total collapse.
Okay, so civil justice is moving at the speed of a glacier, bogged down in endless paperwork. But that civil failure must have bled into the criminal side.
It definitely did.
Because if people know the civil courts are useless, they are going to settle their disputes outside the law.
That is exactly the causality we see. The criminal courts became a much darker, much more violent theater of failure.
How were the criminal courts structured?
Well, the British model relied on European judges going on circuit. So they would travel from district to district, holding trials every 6 months.
And these judges are arriving in remote provinces completely unprepared for the reality of the violence.
Completely unprepared. The primary terror mentioned in the documents is something called dacoity.
Dacoity. What exactly is that?
Yes, dacoity refers to heavily organized, armed gang robbery. And it was often attended with torture and murder. The source material is chilling when describing these gangs.
Really? What do they say?
The report notes that these robbers glory in the dread their names inspire. They operated openly because the local populace was absolutely paralyzed by terror.
If the locals are that terrified, how does a European circuit judge who only rolls into town twice a year even begin to gather evidence? I mean, the British system requires sworn testimony and cross-examination.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the judges found themselves utterly defeated by systemic weaponized perjury.
Perjury?
Yeah. Witness testimony was completely unreliable, but not just because people refused to speak.
It was the sheer theatricality of the lies that blows my mind.
Oh, wicked performance.
You are describing courtrooms where an accused murderer, a known dacoit, stands trial. And suddenly, the defense produces a dozen witnesses who all swear to a perfectly coordinated alibi.
Exactly. And the sociology behind that perjury is fascinating. You have to think about it from the villager's perspective.
Right.
A villager weighing whether to tell the truth has to look at the power dynamics. On one side, you have a European judge who will be gone in 2 days. On the other side, you have a ruthless gang embedded in the local geography who will burn your house down the very moment the judge leaves.
That is a terrifying choice.
And furthermore, village structures were incredibly tight-knit. Clan loyalties and communal survival always outweighed any abstract allegiance to a foreign court.
So they would construct these flawless narratives, no contradictions, perfect timelines.
Flawless.
Meanwhile, the prosecution might present confessions that were, visibly extorted by the local police. How is a judge supposed to render a verdict when literally everyone in the room is lying for different reasons?
They openly admitted they couldn't. The report contains letters from these circuit judges, and their candidness is just striking. They confessed to a complete ignorance of the natives' domestic life, their customs, and their everyday character.
Just totally out of their depth.
One judge wrote in sheer frustration, asking how anyone could distinguish between mistake and imposture in that environment.
Because the legal standard they were trying to uphold actually became a weapon against them. In a European court, if there is reasonable doubt, you acquit. And because everything was shrouded in coordinated lies, there was always doubt.
Precisely. The rigid adherence to European evidentiary standards essentially guaranteed the dacoits would walk free.
That's incredibly frustrating.
The administration of justice actually became a scourge. The criminals learned exactly how to game the procedural loopholes while the victims learned that the British courts could not protect them.
Which exposes the most glaring operational hole in this entire ecosystem. Because if the judges can't convict the dacoits because of the perjury, who is out in the jungle actually trying to catch them, we have to look at how the policing was structured.
This raises an important question,
Right.
because we have to think back to our baseline. Under the old system, who held the police power?
The Zemindars.
Right.
But the British had aggressively stripped them of that power during the system update.
They completely dismantled the traditional networks. The village watchmen, known as posbons or pikes, were supported by land grants from the Zemindars.
And the British just fired them.
The British disbanded them. They installed a purely bureaucratic, centrally controlled police force composed of officers called darogas.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this daroga system because it's almost funny how bad it was.
It's unbelievable.
An officer is assigned a jurisdiction of about 10 kos, which translates to a 20-mile square area.
Right.
And he is expected to secure this massive, difficult terrain with a staff of maybe 15 or 20 armed men.
It is geographically absurd. To compensate for the lack of manpower, the administration tried to motivate the darogas with a gig economy-style incentive structure.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they offered a 10 rupee bounty for every convicted gang robber brought in, plus a percentage of any stolen property they recovered.
But wait, we just established that the criminal courts were almost entirely incapable of securing a conviction because of the perjury.
Exactly.
So how could a police officer ever collect that bounty legally?
They couldn't. The incentive structure was entirely broken by the failure of the courts. Consequently, the darogas turned to rampant corruption to make money.
It's shocking.
Right. They became objects of absolute fear. They would extort villagers, arrest innocent people just to demand release fees, or simply take bribes directly from the dacoits to look the other way.
And what happened to the thousands of traditional village watchmen, the pikes who lost their jobs and their land grants when the British fired them?
The historical record is incredibly blunt about their fate. Having lost a legitimate means of survival, the documents note they have recourse to thieving for a livelihood.
Oh.
The very individuals who possessed the local knowledge to guard the villages became the primary robbers. The system update literally criminalized the security force.
It is just a breathtaking cascade of institutional failure. And this leads to a massive realization by the British administration, right? Faced with an unprecedented, uncontrollable crime wave, they are forced to admit their entire philosophy was flawed.
The report explicitly states they recognized Lord Cornwallis' system as a radical error.
Wow, they actually admitted it.
They had to. The administration finally understood that you cannot simply delete a centuries-old social infrastructure and replace it with a spreadsheet.
Right.
They were forced to pass new regulations, formally reinstating respectable local inhabitants and the Zemindars as omines, or commissioners of police. They had to empower the traditional structures just to stop the bleeding.
So we have walked through catastrophic failures in revenue collection, civil litigation, criminal trials, and policing.
A clean sweep of disasters.
Truly. Looking at all this evidence, is there any indication that the British administration actually learned from this copy-paste disaster? Did they try anything different in other regions?
The adaptation was slow, but we do see a fascinating shift when the empire began expanding into new territories. They started to heavily scrutinize the Bengal Code before applying it elsewhere.
Okay, that's a start.
A primary example of this hesitation is seen in the city and province of Benares.
Right, Benares. That was managed by a British resident named Jonathan Duncan.
Yes, Jonathan Duncan.
He seems to be one of the rare administrators who looked at the local landscape and decided to accommodate the existing culture rather than just bulldoze it.
Duncan was deeply pragmatic. He conducted attentive local investigations to understand the societal bedrock. Benares was an immensely important religious center for Hindus. Duncan recognized that blindly enforcing British legal equality, meaning treating every caste exactly the same under the law, would trigger a massive revolt. So he tailored the rules to fit the cultural reality.
And the specific tailored laws are wild to read.
They really are.
Like under Duncan's system for Benares, there was a special indulgence granted where no Brahmin could be put to death, regardless of the severity of their crime. Their ultimate sentence was mitigated to transportation, effectively exiling them instead.
Exactly. That was a direct structural concession to the intense religious reverence held for the Brahmin caste.
It makes sense if you're trying to keep the peace.
It does. However, Duncan didn't just passively accept every custom. He used that tailored authority to intervene when practices crossed what the empire viewed as fundamental moral lines.
Well, right. For instance, the government actively stepped in to stop a specific local tribe known as the Rajakumars.
Yes, the Rajakumars.
They had this deeply rooted customary practice of destroying their female infants, and the administration officially forced them to formally renounce this custom, making it explicitly subject to the ordinary legal punishment for murder.
Right, so Benares emerged as this incredibly nuanced hybrid space. It had British administrative oversight, but it was deeply modified by ancient Hindu custom. And this methodology of hesitation and investigation grew significantly stronger over time.
Yeah, the documents mention that by the time the British acquired territories they called these ceded and conquered provinces, areas like Oddi, the leadership back in England was actively preventing administrators from repeating the Bengal mistakes.
Yes, the board of directors in London sent firm dispatches explicitly refusing to authorize the permanent land settlements in those newly acquired territories.
They just said no.
They declared the idea premature. The administration had finally learned that before locking anything in permanently, they needed to deeply understand the true resources of the land, the complex webs of land tenure, and the ancient customs of the different classes.
Better late than never, I suppose.
True.
So, what does this all mean for us today? We've journeyed through ruthless land auctions, comically buried courts, theatrical perjury, and corrupt gig economy police officers.
It's been quite the ride.
It has. And what this deep dive reveals is the immense, often destructive friction that occurs when you impose a rigid foreign bureaucracy onto a society that already has its own deeply entrenched, interconnected ways of surviving.
It reinforces a fundamental principle. Knowledge requires an understanding of context. The early colonial administrators failed so spectacularly because they were obsessively focused on the what.
The what?
Yeah, what the ideal law should be, what the economic structure looked like on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
But they were entirely blind to the why.
Right. Why the systems were there in the first place.
Exactly. Why the native systems had evolved their specific checks and balances, and why the local people reacted the way they did to sudden structural changes. You cannot legislate away human nature or centuries of cultural adaptation.
It is such a vital lesson about the mechanics of change. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Because this dynamic isn't confined to 18th century colonial India.
Oh, definitely not.
Think about our modern world. How often do governments or massive global tech companies roll out sweeping, top-down disruptive changes across the globe? They often do it completely blind to the local, organic, unwritten networks of trust and survival they might be destroying in the process.
That happens all the time.
So the next time a massive new system claims it is going to optimize your industry or your community, ask yourself, who is the Zemindar in this scenario? And what happens to the ecosystem when they lose their power?